Okay, thank you so much. So thank you and welcome to everyone to this launch event for a new book we just released at Bruegel. So the book is already available in our website and downloadable for free, of course. And the book is called Sparking Europe New Industrial Revolution, a Policy for Net Zero Growth and Resilience. I think we couldn't have a better timing to publish this book on how to develop a green industrial policy for Europe than this period, than today. To be fully honest, Renilde and I have been a bit lucky, I would say, because this project started long ago, I think around a year ago possibly. So we didn't expect at the time, of course, industrial policy to be so at the core of the European economic policy agenda, but that's where we are today. So we are happy that this book can provide, hopefully, a contribution to the thinking that policymakers are and will continue to make in this space in the coming months. So when conceiving this book, we have really thought about a trilemma that policymakers need to face while trying to develop a green industrial policy in Europe, but also, of course, this applies to elsewhere in the world. And the trilemma is a trilemma composed by the societal goal of ensuring economic growth and job creation, while at the same time accelerating decarbonization. And of course, increasingly important is the societal goal of ensuring economic security, or as we define it in Brussels, resilience or strategic autonomy. So what we have understood also in the process of the making of this book is that there is by now a certain consensus on the need to have a strong industrial policy to drive this process. So the question is not anymore whether or not we need an industrial policy, but how to structure this industrial policy. What kind of industrial policy do we need? And one of the key questions is, of course, how to strike the right balancing act between our established paradigm of open trade, comparative advantage, and economic efficiency with the need to integrate here resilience, and therefore the question about how far do we go in moving towards resilience, possibly with a certain economic cost, and then, of course, the question about who should bear the cost of resilience, of strategic autonomy, so to say. Now, in this Bruegel Blueprint, we have asked some of the finest minds in economics about this industrial policy dilemma for Europe, and we asked them to tackle this question from their own perspective. So what is the result is a book that, as you can all see, if you're interested in going through the book itself, has a variety of perspectives tackling both European domestic issues, transatlantic issues, and of course issues related to the relationship between Europe and the global South. Here I would like to just list the contributors of this book, who are Philippa Guion, Danny Roderick, Uwe Kantner, Laura Tyson, John Zeman, Alessio Terzi, Cara Criscuolo, Antoine Deschelepetre, Guy Lalanne, Riccardo Hausmann, Ketan Hayua, Cecilia Trasi, Ben McWilliams, Georg Zachman, Chad Bown, and Matthias de Watripon, and thank all of them for their contribution into this collective effort. In this journey, we have been together, Renilde and I, as co-editors, and Renilde will now present you shortly a bit of an overview of the book. And following to this overview, we will have the contributions of Chad Bown, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and Ricardo Hausmann, founder and director of the Harvard Growth Lab, and Rafik Hariri, professor of practice of international political economy at the Harvard Kennedy School, whom we thank for being with us today, that will provide insights about their own chapters and, of course, expand on those topics. Before passing the floor to Renilde, just a very final remark. You can all participate to this debate by posing your questions to the panel by using the app Slido and using the code #industrial. So Slido, industrial, if you want to pose your question to the audience. And Renilde, now over to you for the introduction of the book. Thank you.
Thanks, Simone. As Simone already said, it was really a pleasure and an honor for us to edit this book here. We didn't actually put too much structure of what we wanted from each of the contributors, because we really were in a very good position to have excellent contributors here. And the consequence of that was that there was actually, despite the lack of much direction from our side, we got really very powerful combination of chapters here that were very much aligned here. And what I will try to do is really give a sort of a common story that emerged from all of these chapters here. And as Simone already said, the issue was not should we have industrial policy or not, it's really how to do this, what's the best economically, the best way to do this here, to take into account all the constraints and the challenges that we are facing here. Identifying what's really new relative to what we had before. And the new thing first start in terms of what the challenges are that we are facing, which are way more multidimensional than was before. It's no longer the challenge of just going for competitiveness here and growth, but really also the challenges of decarbonization, of having an equitable for all, with emphasis on resilient jobs for everyone here, and also the issue of indeed this resilience here. So multidimensionality in terms of objectives. And what's the implication of this? Do we then need a completely different new kind of industrial policy given this multidimensionality of objectives that we are facing here? I think the general line of most of the chapters is it's not really new. It's still thinking of the fundamental issue of for industrial policy of where are indeed the market forces failing and where can and should government actually intervene to try to address these market failures here. So it's not governments really replacing markets. It's still the issue of how to make sure that we can empower the market forces here, but still taking into account that that there is also always a risk of government failures here. So trying to find the best way in this here. Now, the fact that we're facing these new challenges also means that we have to think a bit more broader in terms of what these market failures are. And there are clearly much more and deeper and interrelated market failures than we typically have with these new challenges here. There is, of course, the environmental one combined on top of the normal market failures. There is also the issue of, given that innovation is always a very important central part of what we will need to have in order to deal with this, you also have all the knowledge externality issues here combined, but also the issue of the transition from old to new ways of doing here, and that transition and path dependencies may also not work perfectly here. So way more market failures that we need to take into account in industrial policy than before, which means that we will need much more government intervention to address these failures here. But at the same time, these multidimensionality of challenges also put way more challenge on governments here and could also lead to way more scope for government failure. Here there is way more uncertainties. Some have to do with own created geopolitical risks here, but also a lot of technological uncertainties. We don't know which kind of technologies will actually play out and not. Also uncertainties about ecosystems, connections between which kind of players that we would need here. A lot of capture also possibly because there is still a lot of path dependency, reluctance to transition here. So also at the same time that there are more market failures, there is also more risk for government failure here. And that's the basic challenge that each of the chapters actually deals with. So all agreeing that there is more need for government failure here, but also a higher risk of failure. So how can we reconcile this? And all of the chapters go for suggestions of how we can actually reconcile this here. Still government intervention, but at a way to minimize those higher risks of failure here. And the insights that they all use are insights from economic theory, but also from empirical observations from the past, best practices here. So each of the chapters really help to bring forward that government policy here. But overall, it's still fair to say we don't know. So we need to experiment, but so what these chapters offer is not the solution for this, but really a road to how to experiment best. And I think that's very important to emphasize across all chapters here. So it's really experimentation, and the suggestions that come from each of these chapters is which experiments could we run here, but in any case, since we don't know what works or not, all of these experiments and suggestions should be evaluated, we should learn as quickly as possible whether they work or not and adapt. So that's why it should always be seen in a dynamic learning and a smart policy making here, where we can offer ways of learning, but clearly there also needs to be this dynamic perspective of adapting as much as possible these policy proposals that we have here. It's also not about the state replacing the market here, it's always leveraging, as already said, so it's always looking for public-private partnerships, and each of the two sides, governments as well as markets, trying to have their comparative advantage optimally combined here, so that we get to win-win kind of solutions here. Clearly, in all chapters also more directionality than before here, but that doesn't mean that any kind of way of choosing is what we go for. These choices should still be very carefully, in order to avoid market failure, should clearly be monitored as much as possible here. It's also not just one choice versus the others. These choices should always involve multiple and diverse ecosystems here. So different technology solutions, different ecosystems supported at the same time here, new versus existing ones here. So trying to avoid as much as possible that we pick the wrong here, to have much more modularity in these choices as well. And all these targeted interventions also should be part of a policy mix that includes way more other instruments at the same time here that are more framework conditions here. So making sure that we have always open, competitive and contestable markets here. So and clearly calling for this policy mix of choosing, directing, but also at the same time making sure you have more general policy instruments there that create these framework conditions here. That's of course a big challenge, because that means systemic policy choices that cross-cut different policy departments here, but also a very important issue that was highlighted in almost any of the chapters too is the need for coordination between the different geopolitical policy areas here, the regional dimension, the national, but also the international dimension, and particularly the need for global cooperation and coordination is something that's really cross-cutting in many chapters here, but especially chapter 5 with Laura Tyson and Zisman really make this point of global coordination. Also chapter 6 with Terzi makes this point for global cooperation. Global cooperation in policy making in order to make sure that we keep the global private ecosystems that are already operating as open and globally operating as much as possible here, but still also ensuring this resilience, which is recognized as a fair objective here, but where clearly mostly all of the chapters also warn that this resilience should be addressed not by closing our borders or by protectionism here, but by making sure that we have sufficiently viable ecosystems to supply this resilience here. For instance, chapter 4 by Kanter really makes this point how dangerous it is actually for technology sovereignty to close our borders here and to have our innovation system only rely on own innovations here. So in general, I think what most of the chapters are very much aligned in terms of these general perspectives that I've just mentioned. They are not just only ivory tower principles, but also come up with very concrete suggestions how industrial policy and this new industrial policy approach could be progressing here. I'm not going to go into each of the chapters here, but I want to highlight a few of the concrete suggestions that you can find in some of these chapters here. For instance, Philippe Aghion, who really stresses the importance of making sure that we get the innovation machine working here, and particularly also the new players here. For instance, very much is favoring a kind of DARPA model also for the EU here. Roderick, who focuses a lot on making sure that we have good jobs here, comes up with concrete proposals on how to run public-private partnerships here with his regional business bureaus that he suggests here. There's a lot of emphasis on green policies, but not exclusively here. So we also have, for instance, a chapter 12 on health with Matthias de Watripo. But on green policies, the OECD come up also with how to do this policy mix with a taxonomy of which industrial policy instruments need to be combined. We ourselves for the EU, we also identified that for the EU how that policy mix should be improved here, where there's still missing links here. Ben and Geer's chapter further go into detail of how to do that regional dimension here. And then the two chapters of Hausmann and Baum will go also into very concrete suggestion of how to improve that. But that I will leave to the authors here because we have the honor of having them here as well. Thanks.
Indeed, and thank you, Renilde, for this overview. And why not to start with Ricardo, since that's where you left it. And indeed, Ricardo, you have a chapter in the book calling for a more globally minded European green industrial policy. So why don't you tell us more about that?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, congratulations for bringing this project to this point. Thanks to your leadership, this book exists. Also, thank you for inviting me, giving me the opportunity to contribute. I think the way the discussion of green industrial policy has been framed in Europe has had like two basic dimensions. One is that you want to be the first continent to achieve net zero. And the second one is that you want to have leadership of the industries that are going to lead that process. And so those are sort of like the parameters of the national debate. I can understand the domestic political logic behind these two things. Obviously, those are not your real goals in the sense that what you want is for the world to decarbonize. Because if you achieved net zero tomorrow, global emissions will have declined by 9%, so the 91% of the problem is left there. So obviously, what you really want is to make sure that the world decarbonizes and that you play some constructive role in a world that decarbonizes. And second, that you want to lead the industries of that decarbonization. I mean, that goal might have some tension with the idea of achieving faster decarbonization. So, in the process of trying to lead, by the way, in the process of trying to decarbonize first, you might be bidding up the price of some key inputs, lithium, cobalt, whatever, and make it harder for others to decarbonize. And then you don't achieve your ultimate goals of conserving the climate. So I think there's a problem in the framing of the issue. The way I reframe the issue is to say, look, what you really want is to maximize the value of the green economy globally, and then take as substantial a share as possible for Europe. But you want to see the global green economy expand as quickly as possible, because that will determine the speed at which the world decarbonizes and the speed at which we can control climate change. So that's element number one, is we need to reframe it in a global setting, because in the end, as I was mentioning before, achieving your net zero goals does not solve the problem. You're too small to solve the problem. It is a common pool problem. The second aspect is that there's a feature of the global economy. There's a feature of these new technologies that impact Europe in a particularly serious way. Europe is the largest net importer of energy today. China produces a lot of its own energy. The US is more or less balanced. But Europe has a big energy deficit. And one aspect of green energy, green technologies, is that they're incredibly expensive to transport long distances. Oil is incredibly cheap to move around because it's so energy dense, but the green versions of energy are much harder to transport. You can generate electricity super cheaply with solar panels, but if you want to put that solar panel, by the way, for example, a megawatt hour of solar costs about half a barrel of oil per megawatt hour. Okay, half a barrel of oil. The $3 a barrel that the US is subsidizing hydrogen with is equivalent to 2 barrels of oil. So the process of trying to convert solar energy into hydrogen is super expensive. And you want to convert it into hydrogen to be able to move it around. So transporting this green energy is still extremely expensive. And as a consequence, I think part of the adjustment will happen not because Europe buys new energy from the world or green energy from the world and keeps its industries going. It's that the most energy intensive parts of European value chains will have to move close to green sources of energy. And you want to think about that. How is this transition going to impact the relative competitiveness of different parts of European value chains? The second element is that if you want the rest of the world to be able to decarbonize, you want the rest of the world to be buying solar panels, to be buying electrolyzers, to be buying transmission lines, et cetera. In the end, they have to pay for those with something that they're going to export. What is going to be their role in producing green products that the world is going to be demanding? What is their role not as receivers of either grants or blended finance or whatever it is? How are they going to be able to sustainably pay for the transition by exporting something that the world will also need? And there I think there's a potential win-win for Europe. It knows that it has to abandon some parts of the value chains that are likely to be uncompetitive. Europe is already suffering from that process in the sense that natural gas is much harder to transport than oil. As a consequence, there's no law of one price for natural gas. Prices of natural gas are many multiples in Europe than they are, say, in the US, because there's no easy way to move it around. You have to liquefy it, and that eats up more than half the energy that is in the natural gas to start with. And so Europe has been facing extremely high prices for energy in its manufacturing industries, and manufacturing is trying to relocate. So this, I think, opens up a possibility of really great win-win opportunities where this willingness of Europe to do industrial policy will allow it to learn, to develop technologies, to explore technological opportunities, to come up with solutions, but then to also carve out a role for the rest of the world, for the activities that can locate closer to green sources of energy, put some things there, earn money by tackling other parts of the value chain that are more skill intensive, that are more knowledge intensive, that are less energy intensive. But sometimes when I read documents coming from Europe, I hear a little bit too much of a protectionist industrial agenda that does not adequately incorporate something that will make European industry globally competitive and technologically significant worldwide. So our idea was to frame green industrial policy in a globally aware way. Thank you very much.
Ricardo, and indeed, I think this is one of the crucial issues when it comes to the development of a European green industrial policy, because one of the things we can see very clearly is that there is a very profound interplay between industrial policy domestically plus development policy and ultimately foreign policy. So how to square this circle is very important. I think we see some attempts at the EU level with the Global Gateway to go in this direction of trying to reconcile these different policy goals, but this is certainly not trivial, and I'm sure we might have the opportunity to come back to that later in the discussion about how to operationalize this view. But before that, let's move to Chad. And of course, Chad wrote a very important chapter in the book concerning the electric vehicles supply chains as an example in the transatlantic tensions also when it comes to industrial policy. So, Chad, why don't you introduce us to this important and very timely topic, and then we take it from there.
Thanks very much. And just like Ricardo, I wanted to congratulate you both on this incredible piece of work and for the very generous opportunity to be a part of it. So I'm the American weighing in and or contributing something to the conversation about industrial policy in Europe. But the way that I think about this is exactly as Reinhilde framed it, which is even when we're talking about industrial policy now, it very much needs to be done in a cooperative way. And this is something that, when it comes to things like industrial policy, we've never really done before. We don't really think about industrial policy as, elevating supply chains and things like that. And so there's a lot to have to think about that's actually quite different from probably how we've thought about industrial policy in the past. And so my contribution to the book is titled Industrial Policy for Electric Vehicle Supply Chains. So it's going to focus on EVs and the US-EU fight over the Inflation Reduction Act. And it tells that story because I think it's an important case study to help us understand some of the real big difficulties and challenges as we head down this path. So just as a starting point, sitting here in Washington in the United States, we're a huge emitter of greenhouse gases, second biggest in the world following China. A huge chunk of our emissions come from transportation. So about 40% of our carbon dioxide emissions comes out of the transport sector. And the largest chunk of that is personal vehicles. It's a large country. People like to drive around. This is just sort of who we are as Americans. And Americans were also very, very slow to switch over from internal combustion engine vehicles to EVs. So as of 2021, it was only about 5%, less than 5% of new vehicles coming onto the market in any given year were electric. And this was compared to 16% even in China and 18% in Europe. So the United States was just a big laggard. We also have a huge, huge legacy internal combustion engine vehicle industry, much like you have there in Europe, which means during this transition, we're very, very worried about job loss. We're worried about dislocation. And a lot of these workers are in politically sensitive areas of the United States, swing states. So Michigan, Ohio, Georgia even. And then the other big concern in the electric vehicle transition is so many of the critical elements of the battery, especially supply chain, are flowing through China. And, on one hand, giving China monopsony power is worrisome. They have, shown predilection to use it in the past, even for economic motives, to take advantage of their market power. But in a new world of geopolitical tensions, we've just seen what Russia, the invasion of Ukraine and what Russia has done to Europe. The United States is very worried about something similar playing out for the clean energy or some of the clean energy of the future. So you put all those concerns together, and in the summer of 2022, we suddenly got this thing, quite unexpectedly, honestly, here in Washington, called the Inflation Reduction Act. This was a last-minute deal between, we can't forget, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, an important coal-producing state, and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. And this was the result of a split 50-50 Senate in which every vote on the Democratic side counted. This was not a bipartisan piece of legislation, and there was basically no room for error. So when it came to the electric vehicle provisions, essentially there were multiple things to take into consideration. Yes, these were consumer tax credits. So much like what you have in Europe and other countries have around the world, these are, in the United States case, it's an additional $7,500 for consumers if they buy an electric vehicle as opposed to internal combustion engines. So that's targeting the externality, right? Trying to convince them to switch. There's also provisions in there as well, like there's a price cap and an income cap. This is supposed to be limited to lower income Americans for more budget models, right? We wanted, the idea was to try to create incentives for the automakers to build out models that would be used by the masses. You know, enough of these high-end Teslas, Porsches, things like that only the rich people were buying. That wasn't going to make a big enough dent into getting more vehicles on the roads that would tackle climate change. But the really controversial parts of the electric vehicle provisions were the other things, and what transformed it from a consumer tax credit, like everybody has in the world, or many countries have in the world, to industrial policy. And that was done first and foremost by mandating that in order to receive eligibility for one of these consumer tax credits, the vehicle had to be assembled in North America. Not America, so better than pure local content. It also was extended to Canada and Mexico as well, which makes sense given the footprint of the North American automotive supply chain. But importantly, this did exclude vehicles from Europe, from South Korea, including some very popular, increasingly popular models that American consumers were suddenly starting to buy. So that was the first part and what made Europe so upset. The second key element, though, was in order to receive these tax credits, even for vehicles assembled in North America, the inputs for the batteries had to increasingly be sourced from a restrictive set of places. So this is the critical minerals, things like lithium, cobalt, nickel, but also the battery components, anodes, cathodes, things like that. And the argument was these things are almost entirely, not entirely, but 80% or so for 90% for some elements of these things, sourced through China, and we need diversification. So this was going to play a big role. So that's the backdrop. Obviously, Europe got very upset about this. Lots of economic officials coming through Washington over the course of the fall, lodging their complaints, and this sort of culminated with French President Macron's state visit in early December, in which he said the Inflation Reduction Act risked, quote, fragmenting the West. This is again during the time that we have the incredible transatlantic solidarity with respect to Russia, Ukraine. This is a very, very important political issue. So President Biden acknowledges some problems with the Inflation Reduction Act and says his administration will do something to tweak it. Now, they have limited options. Congress has at this point flipped. So now the House of Representatives is controlled by Republicans, no interest in reopening the legislation. And so the way the administration can tweak things is through the implementing regulations. And first, what they do on December 29th, Treasury, because this is a part of the tax law, they're in charge of writing many of the implementing regulations. The Treasury Department says that, look, there's a separate track of the Inflation Reduction Act for electric vehicles for commercial vehicles. Normally, we think of commercial vehicles as being giant trucks, tractor trailer trucks, delivery vans. Well, there also can be used for businesses. And we will consider, for the purposes of IRA, a leased vehicle as qualifying under this separate track. And why this is important is because under the separate track, in order to get access to tax credits there, the vehicle no longer had to be assembled in North America. There was also no price cap. There was also no income cap. There was also no battery sourcing in selective areas, in particular outside of China. None of those constraints either. So what happened is quite amazing. We looked at the data. You can get access to leasing data from some private companies. And in December, so before this announcement was made, it was less than 10% of new electric vehicles entering the US market were being leased. By March, April, that's up around now 40%. So the car companies have figured out how to take advantage of this other option, including the car companies for Europe. So the big German automakers in particular. The second thing the administration has done is to say, well, those sourcing criteria, the way the law is written is the critical minerals especially can either come from the United States, they can be recycled, or they can come from a free trade agreement partner. Free trade agreement with small f, T, and A. And nowhere in the Inflation Reduction Act does it define what a free trade agreement is. So Treasury said, well, we'll come up with a creative definition, meet these criteria, and we'll allow countries to then negotiate with us to be able to qualify for being called a free trade agreement for the purpose of this particular part, Section 30D of the Inflation Reduction Act. And so Europe has started that process of negotiating a deal with the United States that would potentially give battery inputs, critical minerals at least, that might be processed in Europe, access to this tax credit. So you put all those two things together, the leasing rates, I already mentioned, went up. When we look at the trade data, there's absolutely no fall off in European exports of electric vehicles to the United States. Same thing for South Korea. And so the tweaks that the administration made in trying to work together, trying to accommodate concerns somehow, seem to have worked, at least for electric vehicles. Now, the last point that I'll make, though, is that's a very, very small, that's kind of an amazing story in and of itself, but this is a very, very small part of the Inflation Reduction Act. And for all of the other parts, whether you're talking about wind, solar, clean hydrogen, carbon capture, things like that, the concerns that Europe had in terms of local content requirements are all still there. Those really haven't been fixed, as is the broader challenge of the differing approaches the United States and Europe seem to be taking when it comes to tackling climate change. The United States subsidizing, which will ultimately, all else equal, tend to lower energy prices in the United States, whereas Europe was intending, through Fit for 55 and the various programs embodied there, carbon pricing, which would lead, all else equal, to higher energy prices. There's some international competitiveness concerns there. And so my sense is that this issue of transatlantic, not necessarily conflict, but challenges that need to be managed is not yet over. And so we'll see what happens, and we'll have to keep track of that closely. Thanks.
To end your overview, because it gives some flavor about what that, the fact that the story is yet to be fully written when it comes to the IRA and the interplay with the European reaction to that. And we do have some questions concerning this topic coming up, of course, online, but the way we might start to collect questions online is by picking up a question to Riccardo from a person that, of course, Riccardo, you know well, Alessio Terzi, also a co-author in this book. And Alessio asks you, Riccardo, if you are concerned of a green mineral resource course in case developing countries focus on that part of the green supply chain. What would you answer, Alessio, with this regard?
I was muted, as usual. I think I'm a little bit less concerned about like a green Dutch disease for many of these issues. I think high commodity prices gets investment going. These are new minerals, new processes. Investments have to happen if we're going to decarbonize. The production of these critical minerals will have to go up very significantly. I think that what countries need to do is to be smart about looking about what are the capabilities that they will be accumulating in the process of developing these resources, and how will those capabilities support further development when maybe this large mineral demand will peter out, because hopefully we will be very good at recycling these minerals. And so there's a transitional demand to get the stocks of these minerals up. but eventually we'll be reprocessing them. So it's very important for countries to figure out exactly how they are going to leverage this opportunity. Some of them are clearly doing it. Chile, for example, has a very interesting legislation to make sure that first the government participates on the upside of lithium prices, and they made a ton of money last year. And secondly, that they focus on mastering the technology. I think, for example, lithium-ion batteries are going to be competing with other batteries, with sodium-ion batteries, or with vanadium redox flow batteries. And so they want to make sure that whatever minerals they have are competitive in the solutions. South Africa has the platinum group metals that are key for fuel cells and electrolyzers. They want to make sure that they are more or less on top of the technologies that are required, that rely on the minerals that they have, and they want to make those very competitive. So I would say smart countries should make sure that they understand this as a set of opportunities in which suddenly they have something that the world values, but that they should develop it in a way that creates capabilities that will have other uses going forward.
Thank you, Ricardo. I think Renilde might also want to add something, some reflections on this point.
Well, not on this point, but as an author, I would also like to ask a question to another author, if that's okay, and to Chet here. So, Chet, I think your chapter is really a nice illustration of how difficult it is to juggle with the multidimensionality of objectives here. So you have the decarbonization objective, you have on the other hand the opportunities of green markets and trying to capture as much as possible green jobs here locally. But at the same time also the transition and the switch from dirty to clean and making sure that that's a fair transition as well. Now the way in which you actually develop the electric vehicle case is that's basically the political concern mostly on how to make sure you get this transition right in these states where there are all these dirty jobs here. But the US has chosen for more protectionism and local content perspectives to deal with that transition here. So do you see any other alternatives that could actually address that transition in a way more efficient way here? So making a more efficient transition without jeopardizing other decarbonization or competitiveness concerns here. So that's my question here. You definitely illustrated the costs of how it was went about here, but what alternatives would you have to still go for that transition challenge?
Yeah, I mean, it's the exact correct question. I think to do this slightly better, you would need to have Congress being part of the process. The Biden administration, I think, by doing what they did in the electric vehicle case through the implementing regulations in their interpretation, the Treasury interpretation of leasing, what that does is that basically strips out the local content provisions for electric vehicles. Provided an electric vehicle is leased, the local content provision basically goes away. So that actually kind of weakens not only that, but then it also weakens one of the other U.S. objective, which was to, kind of move the supply chain out of countries of concern that might weaponize it. But the point is they did it where they could, but it was only a small slice of the underlying problem. And to really tackle it, you need to have Congress be involved and potentially, reform the law. We're in a political moment here in the United States where there's not a whole lot of hope that that's going to happen anytime soon. But we have another election, a very, very important election coming in 2024, and we'll see what happens then. I think to your broader point, this is very much a piece of legislation with its mind on domestic political economy, jobs, and green markets. I think we can't forget that under former President Trump, he pulled the United States out of the Paris Climate Agreement. I think it's very much the intention of the Biden administration to build what they would hope to be a politically resilient piece of legislation in the sense that it wouldn't be reversed entirely by, you know, a change in presidents in 2024, that maybe, you know, the implementation of what we have so far would lead to a sufficient creation of a domestic industry, so political interests, as well as green jobs and workers, even in traditionally Republican red states, that would push back against any attempts to just completely throw out the legislation if a Republican candidate were to win in 2024. So we'll see what happens. I'm not optimistic that much will change between now and then, but after 2024, if it's a new president, new Congress, we'll see.
Chad, we of course have a couple of questions concerning the outlook for the EU-US cooperation, or the tensions when it comes to not only to electric vehicles but to the whole Inflation Reduction Act package. So the first question would be, what are the cultural and political differences that led the US and the EU respond differently to the same industrial challenge and climate emergency? And the related question would be also if and how you see the US-EU negotiations on the IRA evolving in the coming months.
So very quickly on US-EU. So my understanding, and again, as an American, it's a bit awkward for me to try to describe or interpret Europe, but here goes my best attempt. You know, the European approach was much more deliberative, and as an economist, you know, tackling the underlying externality at its source, right? Carbon emissions, by carbon pricing in the Fit for 55 program, phasing out the free allowances in the ETS scheme, raising the carbon price over time, is, you know, has a lot to like about it. Now, obviously, it's got its own domestic political economic challenges. Those could potentially be managed redistributionally within Europe, but those are there. The United States, we've attempted periodically to do things like carbon pricing or emissions trading at the federal level, but without any success. And so finally, this administration said, look, the pricing approach, the taxing approach does not seem to be as though it's going to work. Climate is a sufficiently existential and imminent threat. We've got to do something. So we're going to have to do subsidies. That's sort of the political rationale. Now, Europe might say, well, we could do subsidies too, but in Europe, you know, the entire construct of the European Union is built on getting restraints on subsidies and state aid programs, both to, you know, sort of manage intra-EU challenges. Different member states have different capacities to potentially raise revenue and subsidize, have different legacies of certain industries. So just for sort of internal fairness reasons across Europe, the preferred approach was not to subsidize. And I think one of the challenges that the IRA introduced for Europe was creating potential new political fights between member states, those that traditionally would like to do more aggressive industrial policy through subsidies, and those that don't think that that's necessarily the best approach. So that's my understanding, or how I would frame at least the differences and the historical differences of the two approaches. Where we go from here, we'll see. I mean, they're still negotiating the critical minerals agreement, though again, I think it's less pressing for them to do that now that especially the German automakers can have provided their vehicles leased in the United States. They have access to the consumer tax credits through the separate track. So it's less important for any individual company, say, to get the U.S. to do much more, or even to get a critical minerals agreement. But I think it is still a value to pursue those kinds of critical minerals agreements for the separate issue of, you know, are we worried that countries of concern might weaponize the supply chain? You know, China announced earlier today that it was going to start restricting, as of August 1st, certain critical minerals, not necessarily for electric vehicles. They seem to be more targeted for, this is germanium and one other that seem more targeted for the semiconductor industry than electric vehicles. But China's done this in the past, right? It's restricted exports of rare earths and other raw materials. And so this, I think, is an ongoing area of concern.
Absolutely.
Could I follow up on this? So the state aid in Europe is indeed to try to not use the subsidy instrument, but to make sure that we always have a fair level playing field here, and that the subsidies are as efficient and effective as possible and proportional as possible. So do you think, and we're more or less successful among the member states here to assure this, although as a reaction to the IRA, this is now actually also sometimes put in question here. But irrespective of that issue, so do you think also that we would need something similar also at a global level here? So not, because we know there will be subsidies anyway here, but that we can create this level playing field also so a kind of global equivalent to EU state aid control here. Would that be something that is sellable to the US?
You know, we'll see. I think we are starting to see other countries look at the Inflation Reduction Act, look at the local content provisions, and if they had been one of the countries that had been sort of playing by the rules historically, as the United States had done, saying, well, maybe changing their mind and saying, well, if the United States is going down this path, maybe we would be willing to as well. And of course, the United States would say, look, it's mainly China that went down this path, and it's so large that we had to kind of emulate China in some of the less attractive ways that these local content provisions are being enacted. You know, I think if enough countries go down this path and become so bad, then we will have to, you know, sit down and talk about international rules to try to claw it back. So if there's kind of a positive to come out of this for the rulemaking side, you know, we couldn't develop additional rules on this before countries started to do it. Maybe now that countries are doing it, that will bring the most important countries, negotiators, to the negotiating table, and we can do something similar at a, you know, WTO or plurilateral level as well. It's not happening right at the moment, but maybe at some point we could get back there.
As we got in Slido to you, Ricardo, and the question says, what indicators would you use to assess the effectiveness of green industrial policy? This is a question that with Renilde and Jeremy we have recently been discussing in the framework of the Net Zero Industry Act, where the Commission proposed to have basically a self-sufficiency benchmark in there, and we claimed that's not the right benchmark to track the effectiveness of industrial policy. We would better focus on the private investments that are being rolled out on clean tech. So, but what would you take as a key benchmark with this regard? What is for you the core indicator of a good green industrial policy?
I think the energy transition, the decarbonization agenda, is a major reshuffling of a comparative advantage globally, potential comparative advantage globally. It has to lead to a relocation of economic activity globally. You know, if there's 3 times more sun in one place than in another, the world would be wasting a lot of solar panels by putting too many solar panels where there isn't that much sun, and where the land has you know, large opportunity costs. So the world wants to make sure that things get allocated efficiently. That's going to create enormous opportunities for some countries that were left out of the game beforehand. And in my mind, you would want a green industrial policy that has benefits in terms of developing new technologies. In terms, you would want to track the speed, you know, the learning curves, speed at which some things decline in prices. But you also would like to make sure that the industrial policy is compatible with an efficient allocation of global resources. Europe is a continent that is relatively energy poor, densely populated. Land has opportunity, high opportunity values in many things. Other parts of the world are much less dense, much more irradiated with either sun or wind or the combination of the two. You will want to make sure that the things that can happen efficiently do happen efficiently. And if industrial policy is preventing that efficient allocation of resources, then you want to worry. I think there is a potential win-win here. And that potential win-win, you want to convince the world that it wants to decarbonize. And one way to convince the world that it wants to decarbonize is to give them a role in wanting to sell the stuff that allows others to decarbonize. So they have to be suppliers in these value chains so that they're rooting for a more aggressive decarbonization agenda. Otherwise, they're going to be playing to slow it down. So in my mind, there is a very significant win-win if we design these industrial policies with these global considerations. What Chad was saying is that in some sense, the international aspects came as an afterthought when the US was trying to solve its internal political problems. And then, oh, wow, by the way, what does this imply for Europe? Let's see if we can think through them. Europe is more naturally internationalist because, it's a coalition of 27 states, each one with its own sovereignty and autonomy and so on, and hopefully expanding to include others. And so it's more naturally aware of how things play out. Also, it doesn't have the ability to just print debt the way the US does. So maybe these solutions that are all based on fiscal subsidies are less feasible in Europe, and they're much, much less feasible in the rest of the world. So you would want approaches that are a little bit more compatible with feasible things that other countries will need to do. But the politics of this is incredibly complicated, as Chad was mentioning, and I'm not naive at thinking that it's just a question of paying attention to them. It's complicated, but I think that putting a little bit more thought at the beginning of the process on how this plays out in a global framework is important.
And I think we all agree this is fundamental to let the entire world moving towards our climate targets. We only have 2 minutes to go, so I would try to wrap it up maybe with a last question to you, Chad, that comes from our colleague at Bruegel, Heather Grab. And Heather would ask you about how credible are the estimates of the IRA jobs impact. So how robust are the calculations of the job creation effects of green industrial policies, basically, and in particular to the US context?
I think any estimates are very uncertain, very imprecise. And so the beauty, on one hand, of the Inflation Reduction Act is it's not the government really picking winners. It's subsidizing through these production tax credits, incentive, investment tax credits, consumer tax credits, market activity. But what that also means is incredibly difficult to predict what exactly is going to happen, because we really need to keep track of the consumer response, the firm response, how attractive they see these various alternatives. So trying to predict exactly jobs is one part of it, but even how big the take-up of this thing is actually going to be. The original Congressional Budget Office score was $360 billion. Subsequent to that, there have been estimates that the entire package could cost, over $1 trillion. So that's something for us to have to keep our eye on as well.
Please.
Just as a follow-up to that, is there also then a policy for carefully monitoring what the implications are in terms of jobs and then adjusting policy in case of? Or is it, let's wait and see?
There's not really a policy for monitoring. This is going to be really hard. No. So this is something we need to focus on in the United States. There's also going to be tough to just track what's happening, because this is all flowing through tax policy. And this is tracked by, the Treasury Department, which is very worried about privacy and individuals' tax returns and business confidential information. So even just making transparency is an important issue. Making that happen in terms of how much money is flowing out is something that we need to really be worried about and track here as well in the United States.
So in that respect, it wasn't a good example of what we meant with experimentation, right?
There's still work to do. Let's put it like that.
Yeah, we will see. So Chad, Ricardo, and of course Renilde, thank you so much for being with us today. I think our time has come to an end, so we need to wrap it up. Sparking Europe New Industrial Revolution, a policy for net zero growth and resilience, available on Bruegel website. In the coming weeks and months, together with Renilde, we will try to have dedicated podcast episodes for each chapter of the book. We will actually start releasing the first, I think, already this week with Philippe Aguillon. So more to come when it comes to these conversations. Again, thank you all for being with us today, and we really hope that this book can be of your interest and can spark some interesting reflections moving forward in Europe and beyond. Until next time, bye-bye. Thank you.